Okay, we're going to move on now to the second panel, which will be chaired by Polly Billington. I just want to say a couple of words briefly about the English Labour Network for those of you who've not come across us before. You can see, as you can probably see on the banner behind, we describe ourselves as for Labour in England. That means that we want to see Labour campaigning to win councillors and MPs in every part of England, and we should always be aiming to win a majority of English constituencies. And we say we're for England in Labour, by which means for 20 years, most domestic policy in England on health, social care, every part of education, much of transport, housing, environment and agriculture have been separate policies to those in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And we do think that Labour should talk about England more and talk to England more. And it's actually when we think about England as England that we realise that devolution is essential. We come into this discussion today not with a particular angle on devolution, just a belief that it is essential for the future of good government in England. And the next panel, which I say is going to be chaired by Councillor Polly Billington, is going to address the key question of what would success actually look like? So over to you, Polly. I hope. Do we have Polly on the call? Sorry, I just need to check. Right, Polly, I'm just told that Polly has dropped out briefly. So perhaps if I get the panel underway and then Polly can join for the question. So I'm very pleased to say that our three panelists are going to be Lisa Johnson from the GMB, one of our partner organisations supporting the conference, Nick Forbes, who's the leader of Newcastle City Council and also the Labour group leader on the Local Government Association, and Sharon Taylor, the leader of Stevenage Council. I think you've all been primed to have some thoughts about the question. We're all talking about devolution. No one has come on this morning, not surprisingly, because of who we invited. No one's come on to say there shouldn't be devolution. But actually, if we've had a Labour government, we've been in power for a few years, what would success actually look like? Can I go to you first, then I'll go to Lisa, then to Sharon. Nick.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everybody. It's really good to be able to debate these one step back removed from the daily challenges that I know we're all facing at the moment. And I'd like to reflect on perhaps three lessons that we as a party need to really think about and learn if we're to progress, not just the cause of devolution, but the cause of Labour in devolution. Because one of the things that's been very apparent is that we can't assume that if there is devolution, that the people will gratefully vote in Labour representatives to run it. And that's a really crucial learning point for us to reflect on. Andy Burnham was reflecting just now on the North East regional referendum back in 2004. And I remember that well. I remember the very sophisticated arguments that people were making about democratising the regional development agency, the arguments around the kind of voting system, the arguments around how it was really important that we had a kind of joined up regional voice and that we overcame inter-regional differences. And I remember the packed meetings where people came together and cheered in favour of a regional assembly. And that was on the yes side. And on the no side, they had a white elephant and kept asking the question, how much is this going to cost? The no campaign, by the way, was run by a certain Dominic Cummings. I wonder whatever happened to him. And in the end, the no side won 78% to 22%. I can still remember the percentage now. It was a crushing defeat for devolution in the North East. And the lesson that we need to learn from that is that we were so focused on what the structures were and so focused on our internal tidying up of the governance that we forgot how to communicate what we were trying to do to the wider electorate. And all that then played in was a debate around how many more politicians are you prepared to pay for? And that ultimately is why people voted against it. So the first lesson I think we need to learn is that we've got to get the language on devolution right. And the language that we use in the Labour Party is not necessarily the language that everybody else uses. And so we have to understand that, and we have to find a new language to make the case around devolution. Secondly, and this is something that is a perpetual bugbear for any of us who have been in local government for a while, and that's the party's centre of gravity is just not outside Westminster. It's still not outside a centralised system. And it still, I think, underestimates and undervalues the role of local government that we can bring to the party. So, a couple of examples. If you look at the way that the party structures its campaign materials, it's entirely focused around PLP resource packs. And there are very, very, very infrequently times when we get a local government resource pack centrally, other than ones that we produce ourselves and share ourselves. Another example would be the, I think, lack of resourcing for local government support in our regional offices. And the way in which, I mean, how many of us have done battle over the years in terms of campaigning to try to get resources out of our regional offices? And that's not a criticism of the individual staff. It's not a criticism of the regional offices themselves. It's just a reflection that by nature, the centre of gravity of our party is national rather than local and regional. And if we're serious about devolution, if we're serious about progressing the cause of devolution, then we as a party have to change as well. And I would also make in passing, by the way, the observation that now Labour local government, through the subscriptions that we pay and through the local additional resources that we fund at a local level through our local organisers and the campaigning that we fund, I think we are now the biggest single funder of the Labour Party. And so I think we need a stronger, more coherent voice in the Labour Party. And by the way, we offer fewer lawsuits too from some of the other parties' major funders. So I think there's a lesson for the party in terms of change. But then I also think that we can get very, very obsessed with structures and how things look and how things will operate and what the governance arrangements will be. I think we need to start from a vision of what Englishness is. And we should not be afraid to run away from that vision or simply assume that that vision can be ceded to the far right. And one of the things that we have to understand is that the context in which people understand symbols changes over time. So we have to reclaim the symbolism of Englishness. And I would also argue that that Englishness probably also needs to be coupled with a regional identity too, because Cornish Englishness is very different to Northumbrian Englishness, for example. And we need to understand that. But that provides us, I think, an opportunity to be able to develop that further. But there's no point us thinking about structures if we don't have a clear vision. And no political party has an automatic mandate to electoral support. And one of the things that it just feels like is that the Labour Party's electoral support is a bit like a glacier that's been gradually melting away over the years. And suddenly the glacier has got to the point where large chunks of it are starting to break off. We've got to understand why we've got into that position. And I think that's because we haven't understood English identity and Englishness to the extent that we need to in order to maintain our electoral success. So Andy talked about climate change justice and social justice as two pillars. What's really interesting is that independently, I've kind of come to the view that climate change and tackling inequalities, which are in fact, I think, the same thing, are the two biggest single challenges that we face as a party to be able to present an electoral platform to people. And that work is happening in our towns and cities and led by local government. It's happening now. We've got ambitious plans for climate change. We've got ambitious plans for tackling inequalities. We have ambitious plans for levelling up, if we want to use that pretty awful phrase. Because levelling up isn't just about a geographical redistribution, it's about understanding that there are inequalities within places too. So the lesson there then, I think, the third lesson, is that there is a huge amount of visionary work going on within local government that I think the party is not necessarily using or listening to terribly effectively. And that offers an opportunity for an English platform as well as a UK-wide platform for the party for the future. So some reflections from me, Polly, 3 short lessons that I think we need to learn. Getting the language right, changing our party's centre of gravity, and making sure that we've got a clear, understood vision that we can offer to the electorate.
Lisa, can I bring you in? Polly seems to be frozen, so.
She's frozen, or she's very good at being still on my screen. No, I just thanks for the invite, folks.
You don't need rural broadband when you can't get broadband in Hackney. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, and thanks for the invite, folks. It's great to be here. I'm going to start this off with talking about identity and just saying I would be mortified if anyone took away from this meeting that I'm anything other than a Leeds United fan. This is actually my partner's office, so we'll discount the Liverpool shirt. So I came in just as Andy was mentioning Dominic Cummings, actually, the referendum in the North East in 2004, and it's one of the things I've been thinking about as we sort of some of the talking points Jonathan sent over around where are we going and did Labour do enough when we were in government. And clearly that defeat did spook Labour in terms of what we could do on devolution. It did set us back. And when Nick refers to a white elephant in terms of the campaign, there was literally an inflatable white elephant with writing on the side of it. It was the Brexit bus of its stay up in the North East. But one of the things that when we talk about the success of devolution and where it's going is it is underlined by some of the things that we saw in that referendum campaign even then, is the emotive pull of the argument. And I think that's how we're going to make devolution a success or not. Because it's very easy at a time of anti-politics to tell the electorate what can't be done and what's easy not to be done. And one of the biggest contradictions that I think we do see in politics is that simultaneously people want to be more involved. They want local decisions to be made. They don't like postcode lotteries, but actually when it comes down to it, they don't want more politicians and they don't actually want to get as involved as they say they do or as involved as it might feel on paper. So we've got a problem selling devolution at a time when people are quite sceptical about politics and think this is just about the creation of more politicians. And that's why, as Nick said, it's not helpful to focus on structures. We need to focus on being proactive. We need to focus on what can be done. We need to focus on making that real. And because we all know it's easy, it's just common sense that it's much better to provide services, understanding a local area, using local powers to join up local services, creating local jobs, which have skills plans that go along with them for local people based on local resource geography and outcomes. And Whitehall can't do that. And systematically, we've seen that Whitehall doesn't have the ability to do that. And why would it? Because it's not in touch with the communities that we, many people on this call represent today. So coming back to sort of pride and place, I'm from West Yorkshire, so I've been helping Tracy out in her campaign, and we're hoping to elect a Labour mayor in May. But when you come back to place, identity, and how people feel about devolution, I mean, you just have to look at local government reorganisation 1974, and I'm sure that's not the first time that's been mentioned. If it is, I'm sure it won't be the last today. But we ended up with Yorkshire Day because the folks out in Humberside didn't fancy being separated from Yorkshire, because whilst it might be nice and neat to organise things around economic functions and economic necessity and what looks good on paper, that doesn't always fit with people's sense of belonging and where they are and who they are. And I do think sometimes a lot of people who advocate devolution aren't from the places that necessarily feel that as strongly, and that can get sort of lost. And there's a danger sometimes maybe it tips over into a feeling of nationalism that the far right would play on, but it's not that. It's simply a place of pride and belonging in where you're from and that identity. And it can be really useful for us, I think, in the debate around devolution and making it very much a positive thing. I was going to touch on some of the stuff that I know Andy has covered, because I think that the North standing up in rebellion against the Tories has made the Tories think twice about whether it's a good idea to give all those people that power that they'd prefer to keep in Westminster. But again, that comes back to how can devolution work if it doesn't come with the power? If you're going to have to go and bend a knee to ask for the resources that you need to deliver on the powers that you've got, you risk turning devolution and regionalised and local government into a cuts delivery mechanism, which is not what any of us want here. And speaking to local government colleagues, people have done so much with ever decreasing budgets over the last decade, but we all know that we are at a point that it is hard now. Look at social care, for example. It is on its knees in a pandemic, and there's just not that much spare anywhere in local government to be able to figure that out. So what's successful devolution? Well, successful devolution is not regions begging for scraps from the Whitehall table. That cannot be what it turns into. And I'm hopeful under a Labour government that would certainly not be the case. But the balance has to be struck as well. So I'm going to, coming from a trade union perspective, just for as I wrap up, talk about what devolution looks like for trade unionists, because there is a danger with devolution that you end up with very fragmented sectors and sectoral approaches. But if we look at local government, for example, where we've got national pay bargaining, that works. We've got local agreements with national bargaining that works to make sure we want to create a race to the top, not a race to the bottom when we talk about devolution. And we need to guard against the possibility that could be used. For example, if we've got Tory regions, that could be used potentially in terms of competition. So national and sectoral pay bargaining and strong national institutions with national funding and local delivery and local power over delivery provide that level of security, I think, for workers and for residents and for councils. And we know it can be done. We absolutely know it can. Look at Wales. We spend GMB and the Welsh government work so closely in partnership together. The social partnership model of working means that businesses, trade unions, the employers and the politicians are all around the same table, talking about what's best for the economy, for people, for fairness, and to make sure that workers are being paid a decent wage at the same time as growing the economy. You've heard what Andy said about what he and Steve are doing. Sadiq Khan's got a fairness, economic fairness unit, I think it is called, to deliver on those promises. Tracy Brabin is looking at having a fair work commissioner if she's elected. So all those things that Andy said exemplify what successful devolution can look like in terms of trade unions. And I think we're going to be at a crossroads with it, aren't we? And we're going to be at a crossroads with the government's commitment to this when we get to the budget. Because for me, the best way to be able to deliver a post-COVID economy that works for people, and really importantly, that works quickly for people, because people are in a time of crisis and local businesses are really struggling. We all know that. We don't need to even reiterate it. The best way to do that is regionalised funding and regionalised support in the places where local and regional governments know what needs to be done. We know best our economies, we know best the potential of our local economies and what they could deliver if they're properly invested in, and we know the local services and transport that need to go along with that. So if the government is serious when they're delivering their budget about devolution in a post-COVID economy, I think that we'll see that then. We'll see that, maybe we will, maybe we won't. But we will see that, because I think the post-COVID recovery in terms of public works and what can do most good in terms of skills development, the economy, jobs, unemployment, and actually mitigating against the disproportionate impact that this pandemic has had on young workers, BAME workers, on women, on parents. And I think we'll see that or not on March 8th. But I do think it's a turning point for the debate and in terms of what successful devolution could look like. But again, like I said earlier in this, I don't think we can discount either the role that identity plays and an emotive argument and language, making devolution tangible to people, can play. And I think that's going to be our role as Labour Party members, trade unionists and elected politicians in the coming weeks and months. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for your patience. As I think John referred to, I've always said that the campaign for a Labour government needs to be based on buses, bridges and broadband, and I would argue for that to be as strongly strengthened in Zone 2 of London as much as it needs to be in Cumbria and elsewhere. But I'm with you now, and thank you very much for your patience. Fantastic contributions already, which I did manage to hear from both Nick and from Lisa. I'd like to pass on to Sharon straight away, because I think it will be really useful to understand from her perspective as the leader of an urban district council, effectively, in the south of England, how those issues of both power and identity play in places where you might be the only red dot in a big blue map, but you want to be able to do the best for your own community that you directly represent, but also thinking about what this means for everyone else that you care about beyond your own jurisdiction. Sharon.
Thank you very much, Polly, and thank you to John for organising this today. I think John and I have been talking about this for about 15 years or more now, and it really is time the Labour Party bit the bullet and got on with this work. And, you know, I come very much from a position that local power and funding should not be a grace and favour thing. It should be a right for people, and not for politicians or local politicians, but for the people that we represent. They should be able to know that the powers and funding needed to improve their community is there at local level, where they can have a say in them. And that's very much where I come from this. I wanted to talk about 4 particular things. One is, I know it's usually 3, but I've got 4. One is devolution in England and how that's working. And there's been no better illustration of the best of devolution than what we've seen in the last 12 months. The fantastic response of local government to the COVID crisis, you know, tackling shielding issues that failed miserably when Westminster tried to do them, test and trace, looking after rough sleepers, getting them all in, making sure our businesses were supported and well supported, getting the grants out, supporting them to be COVID secure, now supporting the vaccination programme, supporting domestic abuse victims, those in care homes, and now working very quickly on how this translates into the recovery. So I think all of that, and seeing Andy fighting for his community up there in Manchester has been great. Of course, it's important, and I always say this whenever I speak on devolution, we cannot in the Labour Party go on the it's not fair approach of devolution is just for the north of England. We can't do that. Places like mine are, you know, the places where we have a roadmap through to Westminster, to winning power in Westminster. And if we ignore that, I've got 3 of the most deprived wards in the country in my borough, and I'm sure it's the same in Hackney. Polly, you'll have them there. So yes, of course it's important for the north, but it's important all over the country. Secondly, Tory governments and devolution. The current perspective on devolution under the Tory government is all about their political advantage. What they want to do is take us back to even before 1974. They want to go back to 1634, when the shire counties were created, and put all the power with those shire counties. So it's not so troublesome. Actually, the leader of my Tory county council has actually said this. So it's not so troublesome for the Secretary of State. He can just go out and speak to the 12 leaders of the shire counties, and he doesn't have to bother with all of that diversity in local government. Thirdly, I want to talk about some of the obstacles to devolution, and there are many. I've just thought off the top of my head of at least 10 of them, but there are plenty of them. Excuse me. And then I wanted to give a bit of a case study, just a very brief one, on cooperative councils and what we're doing during devolution across multiple tiers to demonstrate, you know, what we can do when we're so powerful and active in our communities. So starting with the devolution in England, I've just come through in Hertfordshire, or have we come through it? We might be back in it in a few weeks' time. A debacle with a hubristic county council leader who thought devolution was sweeping away the entirety of local government in Hertfordshire in favour of his council, which covers 1.2 million people, and was promoting this across 2-tier government in England. He thought it would be much more convenient, as I said, for the Secretary of State only have to talk to county leaders and tell them what to do. And it mattered not a jot that the administrative areas that he was talking about meant nothing to people, and are based on, you know, going back to that 1634 construction of local government, quite apart from the aberrant nonsense of trying to have a local government review in the middle of a pandemic crisis, with a fearful resulting recession, and with the spectre of Brexit ever present. The whole thing was only designed to impact Tory electoral chances. Devolution in any real sense was about as far away from this as Timbuktu is. So, you know, there was no reality around that. And, you know, we see 80% of England currently lives in multi-tiered government areas, and more than 300 academic pieces of research over 50 years have shown no conclusive or consistent evidence that size impacts at all on any guarantee of improvements in efficiency, effectiveness, performance or cost reduction. So those are consistent, but there are consistent findings in academic research that increase in geographical size or population does have damaging impacts on local democracy, participation, turnout and satisfaction. You know, we often get the issue of Europe put in front of us, but the average population of a shire district was over 10 times the average of the lower tier in Europe. So, you know, we can't focus on what happens elsewhere, and we have to work, I think, very much in our party about what's going to work for England, what's going to help the identity of people, what's going to bring people to feel they are able to participate. Lots of obstacles, Westminster, and it's not just the civil service. I agree with what Andy said, it's politicians as well. The complexity of local government, when you start talking about devolution, straight away, Westminster politicians will start talking about local government review. A failure to recognise the importance of local place shaping and what people want to do in terms of that. The issues around technology and partnership working are emerging very quickly and making a real difference here. There is no common accountability across public sector spending. So do we leave out the issue of NHS and academy schools and all those issues when we are talking about Labour devolution? The difference between the commissioning and delivering services. Financial institutions are highly centralised in the UK, where there is localised central funding, for example, with LEPs, it's highly constrained, so it's still on that grace and favour approach. Our planning system, broken and failing, and I could bore on about that, but I won't. Governance doesn't always relate to functional economic areas, and it should. And powers and funding held tight to Westminster, and you only have to look at the recent changes to the Public Works Loans Board to know how that is playing out. So our cooperative councils across the country, we have 34 council members, we've got 60 members altogether, from Edinburgh to Plymouth, from Hull to Cardiff. They cover 9 million citizens, they have budgets of 14 billion. They are devolving and sharing power. They are creating social value and social outcomes, not just public service delivery. They are building relationships between people and between people and place. The importance of connection, engagement, participation and accountability in the democratic process. Social equity, a new model of welfare, decentralised, designed with people, not for them. Building capacity and resilience, not sucking them out. And community wealth building, really, really important and should be top and centre to us in the Labour Party, using the power of public spending to build capacity, resources and local economies. And I could give you dozens of examples, but we haven't got time. But green recovery in Oxford, tackling the digital divide in South Ribble, barriers to the cooperative economy in the GMA, early help for children and families in Birmingham, and my own work on domestic abuse in Stevenage, dozens of examples. So we must only retain those decisions centrally that should be central. We do need structural reform. My idea would be, you know, I've never knocked on a door, to be honest with you, and had someone say, you know what, Sharon, what we need for Stevenage is a constitutional commission. That's what we need. However, we do need to do it. We need something independent to look at how power and funding works. And I'd have a minister for devolution if it was up to me, that is detached from all the other ministries who all have, you know, a stake in this game. Institutions we need locally, finance, governance, regional public accounts committees, strategic planning, growth agencies. Local government must relate to places that are meaningful for people. It's got to, or it won't work. Focus for all public spending must switch from reactive to proactive. People must be involved to resolve the big issues like climate change and inequalities. And Labour's got to claim the ground of real devolution, of being on people's side and showing we are, like Andy, you know, Andy's done so powerfully in Manchester. So, you know, those are my key things about this. We've got to be focusing on what is meaningful to the people we represent.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And it's really great to hear all of those different perspectives, in a sense, sort of violently agreeing with each other, but I think probably quite a long way from some of the conversation in the chat. So I'm just going to bring in a couple of questions. One, first, I'm going to ask you, Sharon, but bearing in mind, I think both Lisa and Nick are speaking from experience of places where there is probably a stronger identity, local, regional identity, than there might be in someone like Stevenage. Should powers be linked to identities that already exist, or will identities be shaped in time by devolving power for the sake of delivery and economics? What do you think, Sharon?
I think that there are strong identities wherever you go across the country, and the complexity of this discussion is that they can be very small places. You know, my borough is the population is about 90,000, and people identify very strongly with that borough. And when we did a survey when we were going through this local government review debacle recently, and people do not identify with the Shire County. They just don't. They know they live in a county, but they don't identify with that. They identify with the place they live. And, you know, I think I know it's complicated and I do understand that, but we ignore that at our peril. So you can bring places together to do the key strategic things, is my view. You know, you need to have an economic area that makes sense, the way you can take the key strategic decisions. So, you know, we have a Hertfordshire Growth Board that's working on the economy and housing and all those things. But you kick out those smaller units where people identify with place at your peril.
That's really helpful. Lisa, one of the questions is, do we agree with Andy's view that evolution is bigger than big, neat structural reform? I mean, I'm asking you that question particularly because you emphasise the importance of those sort of national frameworks of negotiating terms and conditions and so forth, which obviously are naturally concerns for anybody who's interested in national equity as well as local empowerment. Which do you think is going to work best?
I think it's what's possible at this point is evolution, isn't it? I don't think there's going to be a big push. I think it was Sharon that said it. It's not something people are sat there crying out for, is it? So what are your top 5 priorities for the next Labour government? More devolution, please. And it might be for some of us on this call, but I would suggest we're potentially not typical of the voting electorate this morning.
You're joking, Lisa. Honestly, everyone's doing this every Saturday morning.
Well, I mean, if only, right? Yeah, exactly. So I just think evolution is gonna have to be the way forward on these things. But it is complex, isn't it? And that's the problem, is there is no easy answer to it. Because even if you talk about identity and place in terms of where I am now, so I'm from a pit village called South Kirby, which probably identifies more with Barnsley and South Yorkshire. Wakefield's part of the West Yorkshire City region, but thinks Leeds gets everything. We all are proud of being from West Yorkshire, and woe betide you tell us anything about Lancashire until Andy Burnham stands up for the North, and then we're all the North. We're not Lancashire versus Yorkshire. So the layered identities that we're talking about, there are ways to do that, but it's just not a straightforward. It's just not a straightforward proposition, is it, about how people feel about the places that they're from? But you have to balance it with the economic, because it has to work as well. And you do see that around the arguments around One Yorkshire. So we've got a West Yorkshire devolution deal. We've not got a One Yorkshire devolution deal. And the evolution of that might be over time that it becomes a One Yorkshire devolution deal if this is proved to be worked and delivers for people. But I don't really see at the moment an option on the table of an all-out reorganisation that delivers, you know, the silver bullet to have devolved power everywhere. Even if we wanted it, I just don't see it being possible currently.
And there isn't really a silver bullet on this, is there? Because we're trying to solve a number of problems with a number of power and competence, capacity and resource solutions. Nick, does size matter? Do we need the organisation to be a certain size to maximise impact, or is it more about that sort of total place outcome that was discussed earlier?
It's really interesting picking up the thread of what Lisa's just been talking about in terms of multiple and overlapping identities and being comfortable with those, because I think if you look at where devolution has been most successful over the last couple of decades, it's in areas where devolution has been coupled to a pretty strong existing identity. So whether that's London, whether that's Greater Manchester, whether that's Scotland or Northern Ireland or Wales, each of those are different sizes, different issues, different challenges, different scale of devolution. But the one thing that they have is a sense of identity which is above and beyond the government structures, or rather the government structures are focused around that point of identity. I think that has to be our starting point, that you can't create an identity through government structures. We're going through a discussion at the moment about integrated care systems and the reform of the NHS that the government are going through. And the structure that they're trying to impose on our region is the North Eastern Cumbria, which might make sense from an NHS planning point of view and a patient flow point of view, make absolutely bollocks all sense from a local government point of view, because with the greatest respect to anybody from Cumbria on this call, we think we've got nothing in common with people from Cumbria in the North East. And the point I'm making, I think, is that these things have to evolve rather than feel imposed, and that's why I think the the kind of evolution versus structural reform is a bit of a red herring, because anything that people feel imposed on them will be resisted. And so, and by the way, who are we to determine what is best for people? That's quite an arrogant and patronizing attitude, actually. It's part of that centralizing mindset that, you know, we know best what's for you, that we're all trying to campaign against if we're in favor of more devolution. So actually, I think our job is to lead a discussion around what we want to do, how we want to change things for the better, how we want to mobilize support, how we want to bring people together across organizational boundaries, across different other types of boundaries, around a shared vision. And that, for me, has to be the starting point for devolution, particularly given that the government's approach over the last decade around devolution has really been about economic functions devolved from central government. And I think that's missing, firstly, a huge area of work around public sector reform and integration, because one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is that relationships across organizational boundaries have been far more important than structural accountabilities in terms of getting us through the crisis. And secondly, I don't think the way that economic functions have been devolved either give very much power or actually tackle the really deep-seated inequalities that have become so exposed throughout COVID. And so I think we need to be thinking about a much different approach in terms of a closing the gap mindset around all of these activities. And that's why I come back to the point I made right at the very beginning, which Andy's touched on and others have touched on as well. I think the two big compelling visions that should be driving us are tackling the climate emergency and tackling the inequalities that hold our communities and individuals back. And it's possible, I think, to start structuring a really exciting devolution package around that, which plays both to our internal sense of what devolution is as a party and all the things that we hold dear, but also develops the language to be able to engage with people in our communities about why we're wanting to do this, what success will look like, and why it's important that we go on this journey and not be held back by centralising government agendas.
That's really helpful, Nick. Your mentioning of northeastern Cumbria is my sort of reminds me of my sort of allergy to the kind of maps man attitude, which is sort of left over from us sort of drawing lines across bits of Mesopotamia, which were pretty random, and then people from London thinking that simply because it's all up north that it's all got something in common, and that's not necessarily the case. I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask all of you, so I'd like your answer to be really short. One is, do you think we need referendum on this, and if so, should that be a national referendum on devolution or local? And secondly, a lot of people in the chat have been talking about federalism, and Gordon Brown has particularly talked about federalism. Federalism is a word. Do we know what we really mean by that? And what would that mean in the context of greater powers and resources being devolved to England? So just really quick answers on referenda, yes or no, local or national, and what do you think federalism means, and does it solve the problem? Can I go to Lisa first, then Sharon, then Nick?
Yeah, yes or no on referendum. Bloody hell. Well, I mean, we had one and we didn't want a mayor, and now we've got a mayor because it's the only way to get any money. So genuine referendum or not, I mean, I'm not sure that it's the best way to solve very complex questions, frankly. Federalism, I can see the argument for the devolved nations. I do think we run a risk sometimes on devolution of fragmentation. We're not trying to create fragmentation, we're trying to create structures that can cooperate within cohesive national systems. So I'd need a broader definition really of how you fit federalism and devolution into a wider national model.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Sharon.
I'm not generally in favour of referenda, and I think rarely do they give the opportunity to explain to people properly a whole set of complex issues. So I'm not really in favour of that, but I do think we need a national debate on this, and that's what we need to be instigating, rather than, you know, a very unhelpful voting system where people haven't been had the chance to have the issues properly debated. On federalism, well, we've got to end this bended knee politics where we all go, you know, cap in hand to Westminster for funding. I don't, you know, I've already spoken about drawing up to discuss strategic issues at the appropriate level where they should be discussed. And I think that's what we need to see at local level, that we are we're working very hard on the right, whatever the structure is, it's the right structure for the decisions that are being taken. And my third point on this is I really think, you know, we've got to think about it's exactly what Nick said, really. We've got to think about what we want to deliver from this. We want a more equal society. We want to tackle climate change. What is the best structure that's going to deliver that? If a federal structure is involved in that, fine, but we need to know what that's going to deliver for us.
That's really helpful. Let's work out what the problem is we want to solve rather than just drawing lines on a map. Nick, what do you think? Referenda, and what about federalism?
Referenda crystallise all sorts of grievances into a simple yes or no question, and can set back the cause of devolution by decades if we're not careful. So I'm definitely not in favour of a referendum, not least because to have a referendum you have to have a perfectly designed structure that you then tested electorally. And actually I think all of us are making the argument that an evolutionary approach is a better one. I can see the argument for a federal United Kingdom as a way of sort of balancing the tensions between the different devolved nations. Actually, I think if we're serious about it, we should be having a conversation about what a federal England looks like, because it's England and the centralisation of power in England that's a problem as much as it is in the rest of the UK. And we cannot assume electorally that some kind of English political approach on a national English level would be in any way politically advantageous to the Labour Party. It would not. We'd still end up, many of us, with a Tory administration based hundreds of miles away from us. You know, that would be apparent for most of us, even in an English context. So I think the question for me is, what does English federalism look like?
That's really helpful. I think we've just come to a natural end of our discussion, and just about on time. I think the organisers aren't going to nag me too much. I just want to leave with one question really for people to think about before going off into the focus groups, into the breakout groups. We need to be not only rebalancing the economy across the country, which is good for everybody. I'm thinking about sitting here in overheated housing market Hackney, for example. That's not actually good for the poor people of Hackney, let alone for being bad for other parts of the country, and for all kinds of economic and social reasons. But also how we establish a consensus about good values from the ground up. And this goes to some of the things that Lisa was saying about how you end up with a Tory mayor of London, Boris Johnson, adopting the living wage, the London living wage, as a standard. And that becomes something which gives us an opportunity to ratchet up ambition rather than ratchet it down. And quite often with devolution, it's seen as there will be a race to the bottom. This is an opportunity. If we establish good, strong, competent, progressive programs of government in the places where we already have control, we make the case for more of it. And if there's one thing we've learned from COVID, is that things are not actually well delivered from Whitehall by the army and a couple of supermarkets. What you actually need is really good local government with local communities being able to design the solutions locally. And that's where we've seen the successes, and we've seen some chronic failures from Whitehall. So if we've got, this is a moment for all of us to be able to think about what the solutions are that devolution can bring to some of our big injustices in the country. I'll hand back to John now, because I think we've had a fantastic conversation. And can I thank again our contributors, Nick Forbes, Lisa Johnson and Sharon Taylor. Apologies yet again, but you can blame Virgin, that extractive multinational, rather than having something more locally designed and delivered, I would argue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Polly, Nick, Lisa and Sharon. That was a great discussion. Two things quickly from me before we hear from Sadiq Khan. The first is what we've already got today is an extraordinary wealth of material which many more people should see than would be able to join a call on a Saturday morning. This is a quick plea. If there's anybody out there who has professional or just very good amateur editing skills on videos who could help us sort out the highlights of this morning, I think we've got a brilliant package here to use with Labour Party members right across the country to discuss these issues. So please do get in touch. Secondly, in the same vein, if you haven't done it already, please do complete the survey. There was a link in your booking details. It's also in the chat. those who've done it will see this survey has almost no yes/no questions in it, because there are almost no yes/no answers on this issue. They're a matter of balance, and understanding from the survey where the balance of advantage and disadvantage goes is really crucial. So please do that. Just after we've heard from Sadiq, we will go into the breakout groups. So after Sadiq has spoken, Joe Jervis will explain how we're going to run the breakout groups, and bear with us over a 2 or 3 minute period after Sadiq's talk while that gets sorted out, because some of you may wonder slightly what's happening before you'd find yourself in a breakout group, but we'll take 3 or 4 minutes perhaps after Sadiq to get that in place. Now, when I opened the conference, I said that the last Labour government left the governments of England more or less unchanged, even though we were in power for 13 years. The one exception for that was the establishment of the elected mayor of Greater London and the Greater London Assembly. And now we're going to hear from the mayor of Greater London, Sadiq Khan.
I think can anyone else hear that?
I can't hear it. Can you run back to the beginning, the sound going? I think there's a problem with Jonathan's settings.
Bear with me.
Well, it's all gone very well up to now. Surprisingly well for 2 hours, so there's bound to be a hitch somewhere. If we can't get this, we'll just have one more go, but if we can't get this going, then I suggest we move straight into the breakout groups and have Sadiq's contribution to round up the conference. No, I'm afraid that's clearly not working. If you could stop that video, Jonathan. Right, Joe, can I bring you in now to explain